Good, eve- Good evening, everyone. I am Ganesh Chaudhary, and I am welcoming you all in the today's webinar organized by Digital Accounting and Assurance Board (ICAI). We are glad to have you with us for the important session. Today, we have with us C. Dayanivas, Chairman DAB, a well-known personality who doesn't need any introduction. So, I request you to please share your opening remarks. So, over to you. Daya sir.
Thank you very much, Ganesh, for giving a quick introduction and welcoming. And compliments to you for coming on the screen for the first time. I'm happy that the office is encouraging you all youngsters to move forward in a true spirit. Well done.
Thank
And
you, sir.
good evening to dear friend Narsimhan, who has been a great support in the entire ecosystem of the Digital Accounting and Assurance Board, AI, and many other activities which ICA is taking. Welcome, Narsimhan, for being part of this, session today, which
Thank you,
is
sir.
one unique thing. I know might be certain movies like Lagan, or even for that matter, Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, was a slow starter. So our uh, program on cybersecurity also may be on a similar line. But yes, what we have done in the institute over a period of time is that we have always been ahead of time, whether we talk about any committee, primarily when we are taking up newer things, newer activities, we have been at the forefront. Friends, today's discussion is very interesting. Whoever is joined today or who is going to listen to this entire video is going to really appreciate in time to come the forward thinking of our institute and the ability of people like Narsimhan and many people who are actually looking into this as a bigger opportunity. Today's webinar is primarily on SEBI's cyber security and cyber resilience framework, which is being talked about in a larger manner across the board, not here in India alone, but internationally as well. It is so important on the cybersecurity framework because of one particular thing. Today, technology is taking over everything, rather everything. Today, we are talking about creating clones. Today, you're talking about, Narsimhan, you'll appreciate pacemakers. Today, you talk about health apps. You know what? When we talk about pacemakers or similar kind of uh, systems which are being developed, by just having a cyber attack, you can play around with many things. Like you can play around with your heart, equally you can play around with the financial ecosystem of this country as well. That is where SEBI has come forward as a premier body to look in and guide us and also suggest how critical this cybersecurity framework is going to be. Nasiman, I know it is so much critical from an intermediary point of view,
Absolutely.
and there have been certain news which have been reported over a period of time where people, the intermediaries like insurance brokers, stock brokers, their systems have been attacked through cyber attacks, and there was huge amount of loss which people had to bear. Today, the information is becoming very critical, and information is ultimately the oil which is going to play a very vital role in time to come. Friends, it is not a matter of small or big business. What is important is even if you are doing an audit of a small retail outlet, there also they are using POS machines, they are using UPIs, they are using multiple such things, which actually is going to uh, impact things in a time to come situation, including our own offices of chartered accountants, where a lot of client data is lying in our system. Directly or indirectly, we can call ourselves as intermediary because you're holding information of some people. So what is going to happen is the cyber security framework is going to be very critical in time to come. I'll today just release one small teaser to say one thing that in short time, Digital Accounting and Assurance Board, which is the premier board for holding so many things, we are going to come out with a unique combination where we are going to do hands-on training for our chartered accountants to get equipped on how basic cybersecurity can be worked. Number one. Number two, you also understand who will be the right person whom you can hire and use the right accounting auditing standard, use of expert. That is becoming very important. And many such things are there. So I am going to cut my discussion short today because I am out and I want Narsimhan to give uh, throw a light on this with. And we assure you one thing, on a continuous basis, we are going to make you feel one fact that chartered accountants do a cybersecurity audit. I'm pretty confident that you will take this discussion forward effectively. This is just the first brick of what we have been Simon. Let us go forward and welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'll quickly share my screen. I want you to confirm if this is reasonably visible.
Is it having the access?
Yeah, I'm having the access. If you could just confirm if the screen is
Yeah.
visible. Lovely. Okay.
So
Thank.
you go ahead, Josiman. I am there for two
Sure.
minutes. I reach the destination.
Sure, sir. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Lovely meeting all of you once again. It's indeed a pleasure to connect with all of you in yet another interesting session on the SEBI framework on cybersecurity. So, by way of a quick introduction, my name is Narsimhan Ilangovan. I've been with the uh, institute in a lot of technology initiatives, and the whole purpose of me being part of this initiative is that I can learn a little bit while I'm trying to, educate and equip my skill sets as well. So, I'm a chartered accountant. Major specialization is in cybersecurity assurance and audit, do a lot of technology audits consulting. We will address some of these a little later, but I will want to take this next few, uh, probably the next 90 minutes or so, to educate you on what exactly is the cybersecurity framework and why is it becoming very, very interesting and why this gives a whole lot of opportunities for us as professionals. Okay. So with that as the backbone, let me quickly get started. I thought I'll cover some thoughts on what is the CSCRF all about and for whom is it applicable, some sense of timelines, and what are the required compliances, and then slowly move on to things like approach and other elements so that you are able to get that visibility. Okay. So given that as a background and a setup, right? What I want to do is let's quickly head into what is the CSCRF. First and foremost, since 2015, right, nearing 10 years, SEBI has continuously issued some or the other cybersecurity resilience framework. Some or the other information is something which SEBI has constantly been sharing, and it is being informed in the form of regulations, in the form of guidance, and predominantly, SEBI, like your RBI, governs a large player of regulated entities. And when I use the word regulated entities, I am referring to all those entities which are registered with SEBI, right? So this is the first principle. The second thing which you need to keep in mind that the earlier frameworks which were already in existence, right, were predominantly focused on a particular entity, for example, market intermediary or a stock exchange, a depository participant. That was the terminology given. Whereas there was nothing which was given for all of them put together, right? And most of these framework were focusing on cyber security measures. They did not focus on cyber resilience. Now, what is the difference between cyber security and cyber resilience? In a layman's language, cyber security is protection. Cyber resilience is how are you able to overcome even if you have had an attack. A simple example could be assuming there was an attack on the systems, are you in a position to recover very, very quickly? That is basically what we are looking at. And that is where this resilience becomes a very interesting thing. So in August 20th, right, 2024, SEBI for the first time introduced this framework. The beauty about this framework is it made like a master circular. Now, what is a master circular? You've seen in case of RBI, the master circulars are given in such a way that it is uniformly applicable for all of them. Similarly, for all registered intermediaries, this circular is applicable. Okay, and they use the word regulated entities. We'll of course go into some of them. Now one must be always having a question: I have a small regulated entity versus a large regulated entity, all of them, do they have the same requirement? Hang on for some time, I will try to address that particular point in the slides to come. Okay, so that's basically the objective. Now, what was the major difference in the 2018 framework versus 2024? As I said, 2015 was when it started. 2018 is where you have a fair bit of regulations already coming in. The first thing which the 2024 framework did was it focused on a broad categories, including alternative investment funds, including credit rating agencies, including custodians, who were earlier not covered. The focus earlier was on specific market intermediaries like stock exchange, depositories, all those, right? Whereas the 24 widened it, literally every registered intermediary. Okay. Second, it started focusing on resilience. And what is the meaning of resilience? I told you, resilience is the ability for the system to overcome a failure. And it brought in interesting concepts called as anticipate, withstand, contain, recover, evolve, all of these referring from global frameworks, so that it said that yes, my intermediaries also should be ready for that. The third, this is very, very unique, and I really like the way this has been put up. For the first time ever, SEBI has come forward and said, not all registered intermediaries have to follow every requirement. It has gone ahead and said 2018 uniform requirements were 24. It's a graded approach. And interestingly, it did not say, hey, for stock markets, this is applicable. For, maybe a stock broker, something smaller is applicable. Whereas, let us look on the other end, maybe an individual advisor, this is applicable. No, it decided to create what is called as a graded approach. And what does this graded approach mean? That you have 5 categories. Any of the player can fit in these 5 categories based on a threshold. For example, a stock broker based on a threshold can fit in one of them, right? Like that, depending on different scenarios, it came up. And what it also did is that it's mandated vulnerability penetration testing, post quantum risk assessments in case companies are using quantum computing and other things. That's more forward looking, but it went beyond your basics of firewalls and encryption, right? And not only that, it also asks you for a mandatory audit on a yearly basis. Yearly basis audit is mandatory, and you will have to make sure that these security audits, the efficacy of the companies way in which they are operating and managing cybersecurity has brought up. Now, in a Companies Act, you have heard of some concept called operating effectiveness. A similar such concept, if not exactly the same, the effectiveness of this has been brought up for certain categories of registered intermediaries. And then, of course, audits were not so much necessary, or maybe the frequency has not been defined, whereas now the frequency has been defined. It has also brought in a mandatory ISO 27001 certification for certain large category of companies. It is also insisted that you need to do red teaming exercise, right? You need to do some standardized reporting format. So all of these, my dear friends, has brought in, and this is where you will realize that the scope has significantly increased. Now, one should be wondering, is it necessary, right? Why is this sort of, why do you think somebody would probably come across this, right? But I think in the evolving threat landscape, this makes it very, very pertinent. Now, a few objectives just to give you a flavor of it. A is obviously enhancing security measures, I did mention. Second is to ensure resilience. And what is resilience? I said resilience is the ability of a system to recover from a failure, right? Standardize the procedures and practices. In fact, it talks about certain standard policies which has to be designed across organization, right? And promote risk management. There is a requirement of internal audit. There is a requirement of risk management. Encourage regular assessments, strengthen incident reporting. Incidents are basically some sort of a failure of a system, some sort of an attack, some sort of a compromise, and all of this has to be strengthened so that you're able to report it. Because understand, in case one stockbroker who's dealing with an exchange has his system down due to some XYZ, the moment he informs to the stock exchange generally will make sure that this particular system is isolated. And that is where the important principle rise. The reason is, if that system is not isolated, there is a perhaps a possibility that that malware or that sort of an infection can go spread up to it. Of course, there are guardrails, but I'm just trying to talk about what is the importance of incidents. Second, not only one broker, it is you have to intimate to other brokers that such a thing has happened so that they can take that safeguard. And that is where incident reporting becomes very important. And not to forget, ensure the periodical compliance is always taken care, right? So these are a few objectives from a SEBI cybersecurity framework perspective you need to keep in mind. Now, given these objectives, the SEBI for the first time came up with what is called as the resilience goals and cybersecurity function. I'll spend some time over here so that you understand how can you as a consultant or a professional understand this framework and start implementing it for your client. Let's take an example of a cybersecurity function called as governance. Now, governance is all to do with the senior leadership and management. It talks about strategy, it talks about the awareness, it talks about roles and responsibilities. That entire pillar is called as governance. Now, like that, it is identified six broad pillars, and these are called as cybersecurity functions. And one level above that is called cyber resilience goals. Now, what it has done is it has done a mapping of the resilience goals with the cybersecurity function. One of the function of a cyber resilience goal is evolve. This is spread across these functions. On the other end, you have anticipate, which is the second, goal, which is covered via a cyber function called as governance, identification, protection, and detection. And then you have a goal called as withstand and contain. That means I'm able to stop this attack, I'm able to respond to it. And last is your recover. How quickly am I able to get started, right? Please note the respond, recover, withstand, contain are the highlight of this particular resilience framework, which was not covered in the erstwhile setup. Okay. Next, bear in mind that this resilient goals, whatever I'm speaking, and the cybersecurity functions together are the pillars based on this the entire framework is made. As a matter of fact, each of this has a particular objective which we have mentioned, and I thought I'll give you some examples for you to correlate. Mind you, This entire framework is aligned to international practices such as the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is adopted across the globe, starting from the US. Right today, US sees, or this NIST is seen as a one of the best practices, or one of the standard, a gold standard from a cybersecurity function perspective. And by the way, there are opportunities to implement the NIST framework as well. That's a different a day's discussion. Right? Now, what happens over here from a pillar of governance? You focus on establishing and monitoring the the registered entities cybersecurity management strategy. The whole focus is how can I devise policies. Now, if some of you who are aware of this internal control framework, right, you will find something called set the tone at the top. That is a principle which we follow. That is exactly what we look into from a governance standpoint. Second is identify. Now, this is where you typically identify the assets, the employees, the external users, the systems. And once you've identified, you need to keep an inventory of that, and then you protect it. Remember, that which you cannot count, you will not have a control, right? And that is the why the second principle comes very handy. One must be thinking, hey, what is there to identify an asset? You're talking about your office, a small setup. Imagine you have your own branch where you are not sitting on a daily basis. What is the control you would have on that? Now imagine a stock exchange or a broker or people having multiple locations based on which you're working. Today we are talking of work from anywhere. Gone are the days of work from home. I noticed that some of them in their vacation, they have taken half day off, half day working, right? Some of them are actually, somebody is unwell. I have seen probably the hospital people working. I have seen in schools annual days going on, and there's a program going on the other side. Parents are working. So therefore, the threat landscape, or the places where this entire evolution can happen is something changing. And while doing all of those, it often happens that they start connecting to public Wi-Fi's, right? So what happens? What is the sense of data which has been sent across, right? So that's where the identification comes into picture. Then comes the element of protect. Protect is to safeguard, to focus on the resiliency element. A simple example of a protection could be, is every asset in your system subject to adequate protection from a network security, from an internet facing application, right? From, let us say, a simple endpoint detection and response, right? It goes a little beyond your antivirus solutions. Then comes the element of detect, because it is not sufficient if you are protecting your assets. You need to make sure that these vulnerabilities are detected on time. An example could be, it is not sufficient that if you have an antivirus software, it should alert you or send a trigger so that a person can take an action that some malicious infection has actually taken place and immediately analyze that. That is detect. And then comes respond, targeted action. How do I fix that issue? Is it impacting only one system or across the ecosystem? Is it impacting a particular client or probably a particular terminal, or has it impacted the entire branch or maybe the entire network? So respond to it, target the actions, fix them. And then is recover. How do I restore the system? What is the downtime? What are the services that are impacted? A simple example could be, if a stock exchange terminal is subject to some sort of an attack, how do I recover that? And that is where this entire function becomes very handy. And let me tell you that today, the threat landscape, my dear friends, is so much changing that I will have real time attacks actually happening, right? Real time cyber attacks are actually taking place. And unfortunately, this is becoming a problem for everybody. Whether you like it or not, let me show you some interesting statistics for you to get an idea about this, right? And I'm going to quickly share another screen, and hopefully this will give you some perspective that, how these real time attacks are taking place. This is just one example of a company or a website called as Checkpoint, where you can see real-time attacks taking place. So this is a live cyber threat map where it says 60 lakh attacks have taken place today, right? And if you look into it, it talks about what are the various types of attack, some sort of a malware being sent, some sort of a phishing attack, and some sort of an exploit. And whether you like it or not, can you see all these attacks are targeted at India, right? All of them. And you'll also find that from India, the attack is also happening to India, right? From Ireland, somebody is attacking India. So, which means this is where the unfortunate issue is. And look at who are the targeted. The targeted is education, healthcare, government, and the top malware types are mobile phone, where some sort of a threat actually is sent across. So those organizations who give access to employees on the email mobile are actually subject to some sort of a risk. Phishing attack, worm attack, right? So like this, different types are actually being there. And you can see this is basically probably today's statistics, which talks about who are the people who have been subject to an attack, right? So hopefully you got a flavor as to what this threat landscape is and why should you as a professional be concerned about cybersecurity. Now, given that these things are clear, the next fundamental question which everybody asks is, to whom is this guideline applicable? Do I have to read this guideline in entirety? Or maybe, I can probably skip it, right? I'm a statutory auditor of a stock market or an exchange. To what extent is this going to be applicable? So those are fundamental questions which you should look at. And this is where this applicability map gives you some idea. This is applicable for the following players which you can see on this screen, right? You can find that 6 into 3, 18 plus 1, 19 players. SEBI has clearly said this is applicable. Of course, small carve-outs are there. We'll address that a little later. First, AIF. AIF are those which are typically your P fund, venture capitalist, etc. So for them, it is applicable, right? Banker to an issue or a self-certified syndicate bank. These are banks who are sort of helping in the IPO journey. Clearing corporation. These are typically in India subsidiaries of NSE and BSE who are doing the clearing function, right? Collective investment scheme, slightly similar to that of a mutual fund, but again, people pool in money for a common objective and things like that. Credit rating agency, CRISIL, CARE, etc. Custodian, somebody who's keeping assets under custody. Even for such an entity, this is applicable, custodian. Then comes debenture trustee. Very interesting. Huh? Debenture trustee, this is applicable. And when I use the word debenture trustee, the objective of the trustee is to safe keep assets, right? Even for them, it is applicable. And they also obviously have access to some of the personal information, shareholder data, debenture holder data, etc. Depositories, that is your NSDL, CDSL. Depository participants or depository participants through designated depository participants or depository departments through depositories. All of these things are people with whom demat account is set up. Investment and research analyst. This is an interesting bucket. The investment advisor, more often than not, are individuals or smaller companies, right? For them, this framework is something which is interesting because they will have to start gearing up for this, right? Now comes KYC or KYC registration agencies. These are nothing but that centralized agency where a lot of personal information is there and they are doing the KYC. And today, if you have updated your KYC with them, you need not update with every intermediary. That's the whole purpose. They pull the information from KRAs, right? So that's the purpose of that. Then you have merchant bankers. Now, merchant bankers, category one, category two, category three, you have heard of these. For them also, this is applicable. Mutual funds, asset management companies, portfolio managers. This is one interesting thing. There are many companies who are portfolio managers who are perhaps not a size of a mutual fund, but for them, this becomes very interesting. Portfolio managers. Then comes RTA, registrar to an issue and a share transfer agent. Now, registrar to an issue or a share transfer agent helps you to transfer the shares on a periodical basis, right? This is the person who keeps a record of all the shareholders. For them, it's applicable. Stock brokers who are operating through exchanges, stock exchanges, and venture capitalist funds. So this is basically arranged in alphabetical order for ease of convenience. But I hope you got a perspective that literally every intermediary in the stock exchange for whom this is applicable. And let me be very clear, there are 10,000 plus stock market registered intermediaries, 10,000 plus, right? So if your banks were probably less than 100, I'm talking about the main banks, of course, cooperative banks, etc. There, if your NBFCs are probably around 1,000 to 1,500, I do not know, assuming that is the number, right? The stock market intermediaries are definitely much more than that, right? So just to give you perspective of some of these numbers, right? Maybe it may not be a very accurate perspective. If you go to SEBI website, you will get this information, but that is the volume and size we are talking from an applicability. Now comes an interesting question. Sir, is everybody required to comply the same set of regulations? Is there a fluctuation or variation? That is where SEBI came up with a graded approach. It said, I will classify all of these players into five buckets. The largest player will be called as the MII, Market Infra Institution. These are nothing but who provide the entire ecosystem in the market. It is obviously the stock exchange, right? BSE, NSE, multi commodity exchange, all of those. Then the depository with whom all the shares and demat accounts are held. The Clearing Corporation of India, or the clearing corporations with each of the stock exchanges. KRAs, because they deal with huge volume, and qualified registrar to a share transfer agent, also called as QRTAs, right? Now, for these people, the graded approach, these fellows fall under the MII definition. The highest category of requirements fall for them. Then comes qualified regulated entities. These are players who are probably one level down. We look into this, and then you have mid size and small size. And the smallest bucket is a self certification for whom audit is not necessary. But they may not be in a position to get started. Therefore, our advice becomes very important for each of them, right? So the small size, mid size, qualified, and MII audit is mandatory every year. The self-certification audit is not mandatory, right? Let's move on to understand how this could probably be impacted, right? Now, if you look into the entire framework, I said not everybody fall under the same size. So whatever the 19 category of people we saw, I started bucketing them under this pillars, what you see here. For example, if an alternative investment fund, like a P fund or a venture capital entity, if that particular entity, first and foremost, is CSCRF applicable for that entity, the answer is yes. What is the criteria? The criteria is based on asset under management, or what is called as AUM. So if the AUM of the AIF is more than 1,000 crores, I repeat, if the AUM of the AIF is more than 1,000 crores, then they fall under the definition of qualified RE. Just for illustrative purpose, I'm just putting a box around this here. Hopefully you got this. So which means you need to check the AUM of each of these AIF and figure out where they fall under. Based on that, the applicability journey starts. In fact, this is the first thing which you will have to do, assuming you identify. For example, you have a client or you have a friend or you have an organization whom you're aware, which is a VC fund or which is an alternative investment fund. And again, this the simple ways you can always go to the SEBI website and you can check what is the registration type. You will get to know that they come under a particular category, let's say self-certification RE, less than 100 crore, then they come under that particular principle. So identify first the type of SEBI registration and see what is the criteria applicable for them. For example, if it is a banker to an issue, They are already governed by guidelines of our RBI. Therefore, individually, these five heads may not be applicable, but they are already governed by RBI guidelines. So, a report under that has to be presented and not something separately. On the contrary, if it's a stockbroker, the whole principle of a stockbroker is based on the number of customer accounts he or she has. And this is called as UCC. UCC refers to unique client codes. If the UCC is less than 10,000, maybe a very small stockbroker, then he would come under the self-certification category. Only threshold is he should not be providing an algo trade facility. If an algo trade facility is provided, then he comes under a small RE, even if he has less than 10,000 users, right? Clear that. Second, if I have more than 10,000 and up to 50,000 UCC, and what are UCC? Unique client code. Remember, in your family, if there are five people who have a demat account with a stockbroker, this five unique codes. You have two demat accounts with the same stockbroker, but your client code will still be one. You'll have to be very careful on that, right? If the client code is unique, then it matters, right? So it depends on the broker to broker how they set up. More often than not, the client code is set up as a unique, quite similar to your account number and your customer ID in case of a bank. So more than 10,000 up to 50,000 and not providing IBT, or if they're providing an algorithmic trading, right? Even if it is less than 10,000, you will still get covered under this bucket of small size RE. Remember, I told you small size RE onwards, audit is mandatory. Self certification, as the name suggests, audit is not mandatory, right? And of course, your mid size RE is 50,000 to 5 lakh, and more than 5 lakh qualified RE. The likes of, some of the customers you would find notifying, we have 100,000 plus customers, we have so many players, we have so many clients, etc. All these fellows will come under the qualified RE, right? And then you have a two small players, collective investment scheme and a credit rating agency, because they don't have so much of personal information, they don't have so much of personally identifiable data, they do not have so much of what probably I could put it up as, sensitive or regulated customer related specific data, and for them it is okay even if a small downtime is there. So therefore, they are not governed by audit requirements. Self-certification is sufficient, and therefore CIS and CRA fall under self-certification category, irrespective of the AUM under which they operate. Okay. The next, if you're custodian, if you're a custodian, right? Custodian is similar to AUM, but here difference is AUC, asset under custody. And here it is based on only three categories: qualified, mid-size, and small. Remember, MIIs mostly none of these guys will fall under, because I already made a list of people for whom MIIs will stand applicable. So if you're a custodian, 10 lakh and above is qualified RE, 1 lakh and above, but less than 10 lakh will fall under a mid-size RE, and then you have a small size RE. SEBI identified that I cannot have a self-certification RE in this space because of the assets which they have under custody. I want them to be subject to an audit. Debenture trustee would typically come under the self-certification category, right? Typically, in the last 3 financial years, if the debt has been issued and they are a debenture trustee, yes. Otherwise, they will be excluded from CSCRF. Then comes DP. DP is nothing but a depository participant. If it is an institution, irrespective of the number of clients, it doesn't matter. You're a qualified RE. If you're a non-institution, one level down, mid-size RE. So by now you'd have understood that the highest requirements of compliance is for MII, the least requirement of compliance for self-certification, and the other three slightly fluctuate. If you're an investment advisor, basically advising people as to what, where to invest, etc., please note, SEBI requires a registration for that as well, right? Only then you can go ahead and make your advice. And for that advice, they give you a fee, right? Different methods of fee and other things. So if it is an individual who is doing advising, you don't require any sort of SEBI cyber security complaints. If it's a non-individual, that means formed as an LLP, formed as a private limited, formed as a consulting company, whatever it is, in that case, you'll be treated as small size RE and you'll have to demonstrate this requirement. If you're a research analyst, generally these research analysts would be also having any other categorization. So depending upon the institutional RA, what registration they fall under, then you will actually look into it. Then comes KRA. KRA will always be treated as MII. And that is why I told you these guys will have the highest requirements. Then you have merchant bankers. For them, it is dependent upon what is their legal status, right? If a merchant banker is not covered under a qualified RE or mid-size, only then they come under small size. So we'll have to look into this very carefully. Entities that are part of conglomerate or systematic important financial institutions, then they fall under qualified RE. All other cases, they come under a mid-size RE. Otherwise, if they're not covered in both of these, basically engaged in issue management, IPO, buyback, delisting, that means they're dealing with publicly, huge transaction, mid-size RE. Otherwise, they come under a small size RE. Then comes your mutual fund and asset management company. Here again, it is based on AUM. And here they have only three categories: 1 lakh crore, 10,000 crore to 1 lakh, and less than 10,000 crore, again based on AUM. Then you have portfolio managers. Here, portfolio managers don't have a qualified RE. They have only mid-size, small size, and self-certification. Here, because portfolio managers are, they manage a smaller fund, not as huge as mutual funds. So 3,000 and above will land you in mid-size. 1,000 above is small size, and less than 1,000 will be self-certification. A registrar and share transfer agent, if their servicing portfolios are more than 2 crore, you are treated as QRTA, qualified RTA. Otherwise, you will only be a mid-size or a small size. Again, here no self-certification because of the volume of data you're handling. Venture capital fund, similar to that of AIF, which you see in the previous slide, 10,000, 1,000 crores and above will be a qualified, 500 to 1,000 will be mid-size, and then your small size is 100 to 500, and self-certification is less than 100. So therefore, even if you have a VC firm with 1 crore of capital, this becomes mandatory for you. Now, small set of exclusions which they have given, right? Foreign portfolio investors. Your FIIs, earlier FPIs, all these players today are excluded. Foreign venture capitalist entities are excluded. Individual investment advisor are excluded, as I already spoke. Then clearing corporation and qualified depository participants are given that exemption. Vault managers, RTS serving less than 10,000. REITs and InvITs, right? Real estate investment trust and infrastructure investment trust. For these set of players, this is exempted. But otherwise, technically, for everybody, this is applicable. Now, we have been telling that, there's a lot of things in this framework. What exactly does this framework ask for, right? Before that, I'll just pause for a minute. If there's any questions, I'll probably take that, right? So that you are able to, address some of these questions at an immediate parlance. If there's any questions which has come up, I can quickly take it. Otherwise, I will quickly move on. Okay, so it looks like we don't have much of questions, so that is fine. And by the way, I just thought I should also give you an overview of where you can go and find this circular. And let me tell you, it is not so easy because this circular is a fairly very detailed one. Very detailed, right? I almost slept twice by the time I, read through that circular. A little boring, but yes, initially it was a little text heavy. So if you notice this, can you see the number of pages here? It is 205 pages. That's the volume, right? 205 pages, SEBI Cybersecurity Framework. And you can notice that whom all is applicable, and they explain all of this. And they speak about all these fancy terminologies which we just mentioned. And the list goes a little endless, right? So anyways, we'll come to this a little later, but just to give you a perspective of what am I speaking about and from where am I speaking, I just thought I should bring this up. Okay. So what are few requirements? First, from a governance standpoint, and remember, go back to my principle of governance is the first domain. It says that a strong governance framework for cybersecurity, including roles, responsibilities, and authorities, are necessary. It in fact says that you need to have a CISO appointed, especially for the top two. What is the top two? MII and qualified RI, qualified RE, sorry, beg your pardon. Mandatory, you need to appoint a CISO. For the other three, which is self-certification, your mid-size, small size and mid-size, they are okay not to have a CISO, but you should have a designated person who will do reporting to SEBI if there is a requirement. Right? That itself is the first thing. Second, the risk management. You need to have a mechanism to identify, assess, mitigate, and monitor cyber risk. This is very crucial. And cyber risk is beyond information technology, beyond your IT and the systems. It is also onto your publicly facing websites. It is also on your internet facing or places where your personal information and all of those things are captured, right? What it does interestingly is it gives what is called RE's risk tolerance and appetite should be documented. How do you classify this? What are the types of information assets, right? Defining the mitigation measures. All of these are necessary, and by now you'd have understood it is not an easy job to define all of this. By the way, don't tell I'll go to chat GPT and generate a policy. Right? It may be a simple policy to get started with, but I think I have my own reservations because designing a policy requires you to reasonably understand how the organization and setup works. Third, very crucial, critical system identification and managing. You need to do or identify what are the critical systems based on the sensitivity and criticality. Identify what are the business operations, the services, how do you manage the data. All of this is something which you have to address, and keep an accurate, updated inventory of all IT assets, including hardware, software, digital assets, whatever it is. All of these you will have to do that, right? And then comes the element of IAM controls, identity and access management controls. Here, let me tell you, my dear friends, you need to bring in robust access control mechanism. And this includes principle of least privilege, that is, give access only when it is necessary, right? Enable multi-factor authentication. Today, most of us have receive an OTP when you're logging into a bank account, right? Because it is making sure that only authorized person is logging in. But what happens to your email ID? You have a multi-factor authentication enabled, right? It's something which you have to question. Second, you're connecting to a VPN connection. Does the VPN have a mandatory OTP? Right? It is not so. Most of the cases, VPN has only a username password. That is also an area which you have to look into. So, how do I identify trusted network? So, all of these are to do with your identity and access, also popularly called as IAM controls. Then comes elements of data security and protection. You have something called as a regulatory data. How do you process this regulatory data, right? What is the data which is generated and managed during this entire classification? How secure is that? You have a backing up mechanism. Is that backup being done daily on a consistent basis? And by the way, that backup or the data, especially the regulatory data, should be stored only within the legal boundaries of India. So even if you are using a cloud service, please double check whether the cloud has physically hosted the hardware in India or abroad. That is something which you have to get a convincing answer. Then comes a very unique requirement. In fact, I will address this a little later in time. Something called as a SOC, Security Operations Center. By the way, this SOC is not SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3, which you might have heard of. This is a Security Operations Center where some of these real-time threats and monitoring has to happen. You remember I showed you that chart sometime back where threat landscape everybody was taking place. So that is your security operations center where MIIs, qualified REs are supposed to have their own SOC. For the smaller players, you can adopt to the SEBI market SOC, right? So that is something which you can do. Then there is a mandatory vulnerability and penetration testing, also called as ethical hacking. And this should be done for all the critical assets. And this should be done by cert in empaneled firms who have those specialized requirement, right? And then comes cyber audit. Applicable REs are required to conduct cyber audits, and this audit is mandatory for certain cases. It is twice a year. That is for qualified RE and your MII. For rest of them, it is once a year. Incident management, you need to make sure that you have a cyber crisis planning. As a matter of fact, for some of the clients, when we are implementing this is where we're finding challenges, because many a times the first few what we spoke, the clients are already adhering to. Having a up-to-date incident monitoring mechanism, including reporting, is very crucial, and this is where it is becoming tricky for organizations, right? And this incidents should be reported to CERT in case some failures have taken place, right? And of course, not but last but not the least, mandatory awareness and training. And this is all, my dear friends, a good guidance for you to look at how a cybersecurity framework will evolve. Look at this. Nowhere in the past there was a mandatory requirement for awareness and training. Now the guidelines itself says, how are you making the awareness? How are you educating them? How are we training? Right? So the landscape is changing, my dear friends. That's what I'm trying to say. That huge set of cyber threats are actually taking place. And the way as auditors we start looking into this is also going to undergo a significant change. Now, having understood all of this, the new question which everybody will ask is, when is this applicable from? Technically, it is already applicable. From 1st of January 2025, it was applicable for all the players where they already had an existing regulation. This was MII, stockbrokers, mutual funds, KYC, QRA, portfolio managers. But then what happened? SEBI said that, somewhere in December 2025, they said that maybe some of them required some time, and then they give a 3-month relaxation for the first top category, which you see. It was not a literal relaxation. It is not a literal relaxation. It says that I will give a regulatory forbearance. That means even if you are non-compliant 100%, but if you're if you're non-compliant even partially, that means you're compliant only less than 100%, I will still bear it as long as you're able to show meaningful steps before March 31st. So technically, for those whom you are seeing in the first pillar, regulatory forbearance period is also over. So they don't have an escape route, right? However, there are some people like the stockbrokers, KRAs, they felt that they wanted more time, and therefore for them they've given the relaxation that you can be on par with April 1st deadline. And April 1st was technically applicable for all of them. So this relaxation came somewhere in December. But as though this was not sufficient, somewhere in March end or April beginning, another clarification was given where a 3-month extension period has been given by SEBI. And this device deadline is June 30th. So which means we have exactly a little lesser than 2 months from now, my dear friends. Today we are at May 3, right? So a little lesser than 2 months effectively. This extension does not apply for MII, KRA, QRTA. We already spoke that, mandatory for them to adhere by March 31st latest. For all of this, there will be no further extension, and it is said that it will be full compliance for all these people. SEBI had already given, whereas for the rest of them, it is June 30th. In simple language, these players, the deadline is June 30th, including these two whom we have marked the star, right? So all of these fellows, why I gave you this perspective is I gave you from the angle of the framework and then how it is slowly evolved and changed, right? So that is something which you have to keep in mind. So which means as auditors, as professionals, we have an opportunity to do some bit of consulting here, that for the next couple of months, we can bring some amount of advisory services. Now, how is the entire framework structured? As I said, this is a heavy piece of a document. And if you remember, I said it was almost 200 plus pages, right? How do I structure this, right? A simple thing what you can do is from a framework perspective, what is the objective and standard? So those are defined in your part 1. So you can understand these to be like a principle, right? Like your auditing standards, if you see the first part of the auditing standard and subsequent part of the auditing standard. The first part of the auditing standard stands for the principle, the subsequent part stands for implementation guidance. So this is where, my dear friends, part 1 versus part 2 changes are there. So the objectives and standards are defined in part 1, whereas part 2 speak about guidelines. Interestingly, these guidelines correlate with the part 1, and there is a possibility where one could interpret both of them together and take a decision. Part 3 is all about formats. Towards the end, I'll take you through this. And part 4 are some annexures and references just for you to be aware of it, right? So this is where it is quite interesting. Part 1, part 2, 3, and 4, right? So these are the 4 things which are typically applicable. And just to give you some perspective, the US NIST CSF, also called as the the cybersecurity framework issued by NIST, has these domains what you see on the screen, and it also has something called as a category identifier which you see on the right hand side, right? For example, GB, you have something called OC, organization context, GVRM, risk management, GVRR, roles and responsibility, right? GV, policy, PO. So similar lines, if not exact, it has been slightly, up and down, it is moved, right? From a NIST per se, there is similar setup which the cybersecurity framework has also come up with, and that is what you see over here, right? So if you look from a governance perspective, you will still find organization context, you'll still find roles and responsibility policy, you'll find something new called, of course, oversight is there, of course they've rejigged it, risk management is there, and then you'll also find supply chain. So you'll find mostly a good chunk of things appearing here. From an identity perspective, it is only asset management and risk assessment, right? Whereas here you have improvisation, this is moved further. Then you have protection, which talks about identity access, awareness and training, data security measures, encryptions, backing up, etc. Information protection processes, procedures, and maintenance. That's your protection. Your detection is more to do with security governance monitoring and detection process. And then you have your last two, respond and recover. Respond focuses on incident management, incident response and communication, incident analysis. How do you do improvisation? So this is what is used tomorrow in case of a forensic analysis or study. This is typically what is used. And then you have your recover. Recover focuses that, what are the recovery strategies, your recovery plan, communication, improvisations, all of those. So if you notice here, improvisations is a common point in these last two buckets, right? So that is something which you will find it, where improvisation has moved from identity and moved into respond and recover, because it was felt that, we require improvisation constantly in those two regions. So hopefully you got a flavor of how the framework has been developed from a global to India perspective. So if you see our cybersecurity framework, these are the terminologies which I just spoke of. This is the CSCRF. Sorry, this is the NIST CSF, whereas this is the CSCRF, right? So governance talks about OC, roles, policy, risk management, supply chain management, identity talks about asset and risk management, right? So one should go from here. That is the sequence in which you will start looking at this SEBI CSRF wheel. PRAA, which is your identity and authentication. AT is awareness. DS is data security, right? And then you have your detect, focusing on detecting mechanism. And then you have your respond and recover, which is more focusing from a resilience perspective, how well you are able to take it. Fair. Since you got a flavor of this entire framework, now what are some of the key requirements? We'll spend some time. First, it if you as an organization are using some hosted services, that means you have it hosted within your own setup, right? Your data centers should adhere to minimum tier 4 data center requirements, or your complete fault tolerance redundancy for all components. The whole objective is that it should be failure proof. right? So data center certification is what, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. Tier 4 is probably the least, right? It says that to that extent you should be able to adhering that first. Second, from an infrastructure, if you are using cloud services, you need to meet the METI empanelment criteria. So METI is your Ministry of IT, Electronics and IT, where they've clearly defined what is the expectation from a cloud service provider. You need to adhere to that, right? Next, it should be audited by an STQC standards, from a STQC perspective, empaneled cloud audit organization, right? Now, what this gives you is a better sort of a control, right? The whole objective is for you to get a better flavor and to make sure that the quality or the standardized testing is taken care, right? Make sure that SLAs are all protected. So that is where your STQC comes into picture. Next comes your element of data localization. And remember, this principle also, some amount of relaxation is there, but this entire data should be within the boundaries of India. And then you need to have a vulnerability penetration testing. This is nothing but ethical hacking, somebody trying to penetrate into the systems, see how these reports can be exercised. CS can partner with some of the consulting companies who can provide this. Kill switch prohibition. So there should not be any mechanism where there is a kill switch. That means completely the entire system, I can kill it, right? So the kill switch or remote disable option should not be there. That is something which is interesting. Responsibility demarcation. Who owns what responsibility should be clearly given, especially when you're a cloud hosted or when you are having a service provider and you are hosting the data. Understand clearly the responsibilities. And there's, by the way, a framework for adoption of cloud services for SEBI also, SEBI registered entities. That is also something which you can probably look at. So this is some conditions for our hosted entities, right? Now, another interesting point which has come up is mandatory vulnerability penetration testing. Now, this is where it becomes a little tricky, but at the same time interesting. Why? Because this vulnerability penetration testing exercise, as I said, is to identify whether any significant weaknesses are there. Generally, people used to perform this only when there are certain, key updates or, something from that angle, or they used to neglect it. Now, here they've said, even if you have done some changes to the version of software, you have done some policy management, password management changes, any sort of a protocol, even if you have improvised the security, right? Or you moved into a new geography or a territory, added some new sector like a currency trading from the existing setup, or even if you do implement a new process schema, in all these cases, mandatory vulnerability penetration testing. So as auditors, this becomes a little tricky. We need to make sure that you ask them multiple questions for you to determine whether this has been done. And by the way, if any major issues have been identified, you need to report it to SEBI as well. Okay, so that's something from a mandatory VAPT. The next comes a few other requirements, data classification and localization. I did make a mention that currently there is some amount of relaxation for this. By the way, there is something called regulatory data and cybersecurity data. Regulatory data is where, from a legal perspective, you need to maintain. This could be in PAN, Aadhaar, whatever, including some information which is governed. Those have to be mandatory stored only in India. There is no doubt some relaxation given for the time being, maybe until the DPDP rules comes in, digital data privacy related rules. We can probably wait there. Next is API security. API is basically two apps speaking with each other. Let's say you are a cab aggregator app and your payment gateway app. So the moment you make a payment, it will say pay via this app and it opens another app, right? So that's your API. So application program interface. So if you're having this API security, you need to make sure that you have constraints, rate limiting, throttling, authentication mechanism. So all these are a few examples of security measures. Then mandatory a security operations center, and this is a 24/7 monitoring device, which or a monitoring system, which is looking, even it could be remotely set up, but this is monitoring the entire market players on a real-time basis. Another new requirement which has come up is called SBOM, Software Bill of Materials. So there's nothing but a formal record containing all the details of software, various components used, what are the billing software, what are the for what are the components used for building the software, right? The purpose of this is to basically make sure that you do not have any vulnerabilities, or when you're using some open source applications, some many of them are clearly defined that this is how you have defined this product, so that when somebody sees that, they know, okay, this is where risk could be there, this is where risk could be mitigated, this is a countermeasure, etc. Right? Now this SBO is very, very critical, and now it is a mandatory requirement, especially for critical infrastructure, for your stock exchange, MIAs, etc. You need to have a formal record in case your supplier or vendor is providing, even such details shall be mentioned very, very clearly. SBOM, Software Bill of Material. So we all know what is the Bill of Material. This is software. So Bill of Material in engineering parlance is detailed requirements to manufacture a product. Here, this is detailed requirements in terms of the software composition. Don't get confused with data dictionary, etc. Here it is purely focusing on a record contain the relationship of the various components used in this SBO. Now, one very interesting thing which they have come up is to measure the maturity. Strange but true. I repeat, strange but true, right? They have come up with the first time an indication how you can measure the capability of your cyber posture. And it is a complex rate card. I tried implementing this for a client in an Excel sheet. I had to, go through so many things. Of course, we started with Excel sheet. Now we are considering tools as well to do that. So it is an index to measure the MI and applicable only for MIA and qualified RE. Only differences for MII, they should be audited. For qualified RE, this should not be audited. So small this thing. And by the way, if you get a lesser score, then SEBI will come behind you, right? Why you are having a lesser maturity score. So they have decided that an index, in simple language, you can understand as a pass score based on a weighted average they've given. Say, for example, if all your devices are subject to an antivirus system and configuration, then yes, give yourself X percentage, right? If 10 percentage of the devices are not covered, reduce your score by this. So they've given that sort of a measurement criteria. We'll speak about this a little later. But the main purpose is to understand the maturity of cybersecurity. And if something is lacking, go ahead and fix that, right? So that's basically where this comes into picture. And also you obviously can demonstrate to SEBI that you're complying, but how do you optimize the resource? All of those things are necessary. Now, this is an example of what is that. Look at this, 100% total covered into these buckets. So if you have a security budget, that is gives you 8%. And by the way, within that, there are again sub-components. This I'm just talking overall. If you have a vulnerability mitigation program, 18%, because that's the whole crux. Information security training, 5%. Risk assessment 5, acquisition contract 3, right? So they've given various things. If you have enabled multi-factor application across all the applications, 3%, right? Just to give you, I don't know how many of them are aware, our institute, especially the Digital Assurance Accounting Board, has a publication called DCMM, Digital Capability Maturity Model. This talks about how a CA firm can measure itself digitally. Even there, we have followed this simple principle because I had this opportunity to co-author this publication long back. They had these percentage and ratios defined there as well, right? So there's something interesting which you should keep in mind. Okay. So it gives you a comprehensive scorecard or an indication for your reference. And look at this. If you have less than 50% score, okay, RES scored below the cutoff in at least one domain or subdomain. This is like our CS syllabus, right? You need to make sure that all the domains you are clearing. So if you got less than 50% in at least one domain or any of the domain, you will have to fail, or rather, that entity fails, right? And therefore, there has to be subject to it. Otherwise, you have bare minimum, developing, you have something called manageable. Look at this, 80% is manageable. 81 to 90 is treated as optimal. And this is where they say that, oh, yes, I have optimal amount of security. The interesting thing is this has to be audited. Okay. And it has to be audited and the CA has to give a certificate. So it's going to be a little tricky to that extent. Beg your pardon, not a CA, the certain empaneled auditor. but I think this will mature over a point in time. But of course, only the requirement is currently for market institutional institutions, market infrastructure institutions. For qualified RE, you need to give this, but on a self-declaration basis. Okay. Now, many of them ask, sir, all these is fine. What is the compliance I need to do? Right? The first thing I've given is for the 5 categories, what is applicable for everybody and what is applicable specifically. So if you're talking about cyber resilience third-party assessment using CCI, this is applicable only for MII and qualified RE. Only difference is for qualified RE, this will be self-certification. For MII, it will be audit. So you don't have an option there. You need to get an audit done. Next is your risk management and policy review is annually applicable, uniform, right? The depth of the policies will change. Then you need to have certain IT committees, right? And this IT committees have to have a mandatory external expert as well, right? At least one external independent expert on cybersecurity. This is mandatory. Like your independent director, by the way, this is a good opportunity for US professionals or for us as professionals, beg your pardon, including me, right? Where you can be acting as a external expert trying to give you that sort of an advice over here. Then threat-based risk assessment, again, you need to do quarterly, where you create some scenarios, situations, etc. The methodology they have not explained. You can do a tabletop exercise and things like that. Then user access and delegated access, unused token reviews. So all the user access reviews should be done quarterly for the larger players. If you're talking about privileged users, this is very, very interesting. Privileged users are those who have additional rights. This is applicable for all of them. Only difference is the mid, small, and the self certification. This is probably half yearly. For other two, it is quarterly. Training program, again, mandatory for everybody. Efficacy of SOC, this is half yearly for the top two and annually for top three. Very important. Efficacy of SOC, everybody is there. Red teaming exercise, if you remember in the first few slides, I told you red teaming. Red teaming is like you form a team where one team creates an issue and other team tries to, safeguard. So you're trying to attack another time. So it's more like an exercise which has been played internally, but one team focuses on, your own team focuses on issues, another team focuses on how to protect that, right? Threat hunting, an extension of that, identifying the threats and other domains. ISO 27001, this is the information security certification. It is mandatory for MII and qualified RE. But of course, here they have given a time limit that within 1 year you have to do, which will effectively be before 31st March 2026. VAPT is mandatory for all of them. For some cases, they have said twice a financial year. Cyber audit, which is nothing but the certain cyber audit, twice a year for QRE and MII. For the other two, it is once a year. In case they're providing algorithmic trade, then twice a year. Otherwise, it's always once a year. And if at all it is a self-certification category, it is obvious that audit is not necessary, but the element of this resilience and other things you'll have to demonstrate. Right. So what we will do is I'll quickly take you through the framework. And the meanwhile, if there's any questions, please let me know. I will be able to take it up. I'll quickly open the framework so that you have some idea. I'm going to share my screen once again. Yeah. Right. So this, my dear friends, is the framework which you are noticing. It is a fairly interesting piece of legislation. Look at this, 205 pages, quite extensive, right? And this is the initial pages speak about all the high level information like objective, scope, approach, what are the functions, etc. And then comes what is called as the 4 parts, which if you remember, I told you, objective and standard, and then is the guidelines. Then of course you have various formats of compliance, reporting formats, and then you have some annexures and reference, right? So that's another part. Then if I scroll down a little further, you will find applicability. I told you it is applicable literally for all the regulated entities, and we spoke of 19 entities, 666, and then the additional one. Then there were implementation period. Of course, there's the original circular. Little later, some circulars have come for relaxation. And let's quickly go to annexure one. Now, this is where the framework is. Now, in this framework, what you can notice is it talks about some general summary, but this is something which I really like, and that talks about the categorization into 5 categories, right? So something which we spoke of, and these are the 4 parts which I mentioned. And they've given a high level summary for you to just understand what these are, right? I'll not go into that. I'll go into the depth of it. Yes. So if you notice here, it talks about definitions, introduction, threshold for RE categorization. This is where all the different categories of REs are there. What all committees are necessary. And then it talks about compliance, audit report timelines. And then towards the end, you have the category. So if you notice here, GB, this is nothing but the governance domain. Then if I ID, identification domain, PR is nothing but your protection domain. And then comes your DE, detect. And then you'll have respond and then recover, right? Sorry, I think I clicked on that link. Let me quickly go back to the index. Yeah, so this is that particular bucket. And then you have your guidelines part 2. You have some exemptions. Then you have formats, which is your part 3. And part 4 talks about different annexures, guidelines, your CCI is here, your VAPT scope is there, your cyber SOC, how you can set up, right? All of these things, a lot of interesting information is different. Okay, so I'll quickly jump into one example. Yeah, they've given a lot of definitions. They've also mentioned what is a critical system, CCI, etc. You can spend some time going through that. This is the hosted service, and these are the requirements of hosted service, which we just spoke about. ISO we spoke about. Then they also defined what is regulatory data, any data relating to core activities, right? It could be email, communicate, chat, etc. All of them will be regulatory data, and regulatory data has to be in India. Okay. Yeah, this is more of an introduction, and this is that framework which I just said. Of course, here they put it in a different format. I put it in a different structure. And these are all some circulars for you to refer in the past. Then comes your threshold. Notice this, the threshold for AIF. We spoke about this, right? And then we spoke about brokers. What is the criteria? So like this, it keeps on going and defining. And then you have your committees which are necessary. So if you're a MII, you need to have a standing committee on technology. If you're a mutual fund or AMC, again, you need to have these technology committees, right? So this is where they've defined. And then timelines, what is a periodicity? This is the last slide which we just spoke of, which talks about resilience assessment, self-certification, all of those things. So I'll not spend time explaining there. VAPT also we spoke about. And remember this VAPT, you should submit the report to either your stock exchange or your immediate reporting entity, which will be your SEBI in cases, or the stockbrokers, it will be stock exchange. Then if you come down, you'll also find VAPT requirements, cyber audit. What is the meaning of cyber audit? They've also defined the format of cyber audit report. That's also something which you can go and explore. And then if you come here, they speak about market SOC. This is typically applicable where you are not able to establish your own SOC. So you take the help of this market SOC. Then you have something to do with the objectives. And this is where the first thing comes. Do you notice here GVOC, organization context? Now here they speak about what all is necessary, and this organization context, whatever you notice, is what is discussed over here. What is the objective? It is necessary that you are defining legal, regulatory, contractual requirement. What is the OC standard? These are the 3 OC standards. Likewise, GVRR, then you'll find GVPO, and then you'll find GV oversight. That's it. Now what you have to do, GVRM. Now this, once it is completed, it moves into the next framework, right? After governance, we spoke about identification. So you'll find identity. So everything will come ID, right? But what you should bear in mind is if I scroll down a little further, there are detailed guidance like your implementation guidance for GB alone. Okay, it's a little painful, but that is how it is, right? Of course, there'll be an exemption table, but let's move here. This is the guidelines, part 2. So here, this guidelines covers GVOC organization context S2 and S3. GV organization context S2. And here they've given this is applicable for all RE except small size, whereas this is applicable for all RE. This is where it takes a little cumbersome time for you to map and put them, but it is a one-time exercise. Once you have done that, I think this will save a lot of time, right? So I'll quickly move on to the next domain or part 3. Yeah, part 3 is all the formats. A VAPT format they've given for the first time. What all should essentially get covered. Then they've said auditor declaration. He has to give declaration as well. And then your VAPT scope is defined. Then what is your VAPT? What all assets you have verified? Penetration testing, what all you've done. By the way, what is the difference between vulnerability assessment and penetration testing? Penetration testing is basically where you're attacking the system. Vulnerability is where you're using some tools to identify the weakness in the system. Okay, so there are fundamentally that difference. And people generally do vulnerability assessment for internal facing, whereas penetration is done for external facing. But however, this law has made sure that penetration testing is also mandatory. And they've also given what is the risk rating you need to follow. Generally, we say high, medium, low, etc. What we don't give a qualitative definition, quantitative definition. Here they have done that as well. And then comes your cyber security audit report format. This is the audit report format. Fairly detailed. They have given all this information. Okay, so I will move on little later. I will explain, I'll show you how the recovery plan. So this is in case cyber recovery happens, what all you should have, right? And then a little later, they've also explained guidelines. And then you will find some more annexures. One of the annexure, this by the way, scenario-based resilience testing. This is nothing but how are you testing it? Okay, this is just a sample format. This is also called as a tabletop exercise where you're trying to perform certain things. Okay, then you have, by the way, if you're outsourced anything, there are specific guidelines, you'll have to adhere to that. Then you have application authentication security. Then you have this very interesting cyber capability index. This is what I was telling. If you notice over here, they've given parameters. Remember, I told you for budget, they've given 10% parameter. This is basically you have to make sure that the percentage of organizations information security budget devoted to information security. What is the percentage, right? If the target is 10 and the weightage is 8%. So if the information security budget divided by the total organization security budget is 10%, you will give 8. Otherwise, whatever is the percentage, you will multiply that into weightage, right? So that's how you will do it. So like this, they've given a lot of unique requirements, mathematical requirements, right? But that's how they have gone ahead and defined this. And then they speak about VAPT, what is the scope, etc. Right? So by now, I think you would have understood that it is not a cakewalk to get started, but definitely a good potential area for us to get going, right? So how do I implement? This is an approach which currently we are following in our organization, and this is helping clients. First is to identify what category they fall under. And for that, we are doing an assessment saying, oh, you come under QRE. Oh, you come under mid-size RE. We are doing that exercise first, right? Once that is done, we are trying to do what is called as high-level gap assessment. Some of our clients don't have any information. Some of them are starting from scratch. Some of them already have some policies. We are trying to mature them and benchmark them, right? So that is your gap assessment. Then comes your policy framework and development. How are policies defined? How do I make them better? Is it something which is there, not there? What are the tools available, right? Then comes implementing and periodically monitoring them, right? Making updates to this, solutions to this, etc. And then can we do readiness checking, and if we are ready, hand it over to the certain auditor if auditor is necessary, or if you are part of the certain, go ahead and take that engagement and perform that, right? So these are typically what are the measures which we are noticing, and it is a challenge, but I think we have started, we have tried to overcome that, but I think it's going on fine. So many of them ask, what are some of the key challenges which we are facing? Why should or how should we probably try to navigate this, right? So some of the challenges which we are facing is, first is this, the entire CSCRF is one. But the trouble is, this has divided into five categories, right? Now, understanding these five categories, defining and explaining them has become a fun first step. And it is taking a little longer, but that is what it is. Second, resource management, upskilling teams, automation of tools, whatever is there, that's also quite an interesting thing. Risk related is concerned, vendor risk management. Remember, not only should these be applicable for that particular entity, at least high level requirements should will also be required to be tested for some of the key vendors. Okay. Data, make sure the data is local, local meaning within India, geographical boundaries. Considering these unfortunate situations, threat landscapes are evolving. So it is better that the data is within our geography. The timelines, as I said, June 30th is for most of them. For those who have already expired, it was March 31st. But otherwise, it is, what do you call uh, June 30th for sorry, June is basically when we have given the relaxation. And then you have a security assessment. You will have to do the audit, cyber capability index. A lot of complicated math is involved. But I think that is where this entire game lies, right? So I think that's basically what I wanted to cover, and I gave you some perspective. So this is just quickly about us. Feel free to reach out in case you have any questions. Typically, we do some advisory and other related elements, but yes, I will probably stop it there and be happy to take some questions if there is anything specific. Any questions we've had? I know this guideline is quite heavy, right? So that is where. So in case some questions are there, feel free to, ping me. These are my coordinates. You can always reach out and it will be good to, interact and see how views are basically taken and interpreted. But yes, that's about it. If we don't have any questions, thank you so much for being a lovely audience. Hopefully, I've added some inputs, and more importantly, hopefully you had some take home points on the complication and possibly a potential opportunity which you see using this particular framework. Okay, I see a couple of questions which is coming here. Thank you for that. Whether this framework is applicable to banking insurance company? No, this is applicable only for SEBI registered entities. And when I use the word SEBI registered entities, we are saying those people who have a license with SEBI. Please note, a listed company, this is not applicable unless the company's nature of business is, involving having a SEBI intermediary license. For example, some of the asset management companies are listed in the stock market. Yes, for them, this would be applicable. Will CSCRF address malpractices at KMP level as reported, undue advantage of select market players? No, at this point, the intention is to talk about how the cyber security framework and how their system has to be safeguarded and protected. Now, what you're talking comes under whistleblower policy and those which are incidental, not something from a technology landscape. So that is something which you have to keep in mind. Any other questions coming up? So if there are no more questions, I think we should call it a day. Lovely. Thank you so much for being a lovely audience and thank you for your patient hearing. Hopefully, we have added some value into this ecosystem, and over point in time, you will realize that there are more opportunities as it comes along. Thank you so much. Take care. Wishing you all the very best, and please be cyber safe and secure. Take care.